Because of that, with no further ado, I will begin by introducing our speakers today. This, like I said, third panel devoted to the transatlantic relations, Atlantic politics in our conference. The first speaker today is Alexandre Moreli, who is an associate professor at the Institute of International Relations at the University of São Paulo, and he will be here talking to us today, presenting something on the basis for a Brazilian Atlanticism. Let's widen and broaden a little bit more this concept of Atlantic, of this notion of Atlantic that we are so used to in the North perspective. So, Alexandre, muito obrigada. Thank you so much for being here, and you have the floor, 15 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mónica, for the introduction, and I also would like to thank the organization and all the support they offered me to come here from Brazil and be here today. With a special thanks to the colleagues Mónica again and Antonio Almeida for all the patience and help. Antonio Monteiro, perdão. It's also a pleasure to meet Professor Patrícia Daehnhardt and meet again Professor Testoni, who was reminding me. We actually met for the first time in a very embarrassing situation for me in 2014. After a TSA, a Transatlantic Studies Association conference, we watched together a game of Brazil where Germany scored 7 times. Okay. And I hope that doesn't happen this year during the World Cup, but I'm not so sure. This is only my 3rd time in the Azores, but it's also a great pleasure as the history of the archipelago and the transatlantic relations involving it have been the subject of years and years of my research since my doctorate. So also for that, thank you for the opportunity to return here. Well, since the quality of my English is as good as the football Brazil played in 2014, I have here some notes and to help me with the presentation. I hope you could understand. To think about Brazil today and in the future, we need to start by conceiving its place in the world in terms of strategic and economic interests, of course, but also of identity and culture as pillars for a stronger and more lasting international outreach. These aspects in particular involve a debate on Brazilian policy for the Atlantic in general and for the South Atlantic and Africa in particular. While we see a competitive diversification of investors on Africa and we face the expectation that the continent will go from 1.3 billion inhabitants today to 2.5 billion in 2050, Brazilian diplomacy should address the challenges and transitions of the African continent as an opportunity for its own reinvention. As Matias Alencastre and Irene Gala recently warned, among the possible diplomatic actions are the strengthening of the embassy network, as in Kigali, Rwanda, where we are not, in addition to the promotion of the Brazilian knowledge in cities as Nairobi, Kenya, one of the main centers of the African technology industry. Vanguard initiatives such as the University of Afro-Brazilian Lusophony should be reinforced, an institution created in Brazil in 2010 with more than 6,000 students, with 50% of the places reserved for students from Africa. All these initiatives should be included within the great theme of Brazil as a tropical environmental power. It is in this condition that the country would have the legitimacy to join activities such as the protection of the great forest of the Congo, the fight against the desertification in the Sahel, and the drought in the Southern Africa, some of the most pressing climate issues on the continent. And of course, the biodiversity inventory in tropical areas in a space that can be defined as having the South Atlantic as an inland sea. Beyond these opportunities and strategic interests, it's necessary to rethink the identities mobilized so that an Atlantic policy takes place and above all, endure. Those used in the last 200 years of independence, celebrated the day before yesterday, however, indicate a transatlantic relationship in other directions and with archaic and excluding premises. A landmark to understand alternative and missed opportunities, which I will mention here, is the turn of the political multilateralism inaugurated 100 years ago, which finally allowed small and medium powers such as Brazil to conceive and develop new strategies of international outreach. As the parliamentary one, to use Paul Kennedy's words, and join forces to make a difference. For me, this new structure of international relations has already offered Brazil several chances. None, however, use the South Atlantic identity. Actually, while the perception of Brazil and even Latin America as part of the global South, or the emerging world, or the non-allied world, or the third world, was accepted in some parts of the region, this was not true for the important, in terms of power-holding, non-progressive and conservative local elite. These issues have repercussions until today. As recently as January 1982, the Argentinian foreign minister proclaimed that Argentina did not belong to the Third War, claiming Argentines were, I quote, white and Christian, end of quote. In 2019, our former foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, in order to explain Brazilian foreign policy, linked Brazilian history with a reactionary and religious Western tradition. That year, on a tour of right-wing populist governments in Europe, Araújo published a photo on his social media in front of a painting of King Jan Sobieski in Warsaw, Poland. In 1683, Sobieski had helped to defeat the advancing Ottoman armies that aimed to take Vienna, an historical event frequently evoked by radical right-wing movements in Europe to fight against immigration and Islam. Despite the radicalism of our current government, that perception and thinking are not new, neither marginal or anti-establishment. Understanding their historical roots could help us to understand how elites in Brazil, together with many others from Latin America, dealt with decolonization and with the new world created in Africa and Asia, revealing their perceptions, misperceptions, and hesitations for the building of an Atlantic policy. Taking these issues into account and choosing 4 moments of Brazilian history, try to identify and compare the strategies used by the national elite in the new multilateral system shaped by international liberalism. At the time of its inauguration in the post-Versailles International Order, at the time of its resurgence in the post-San Francisco period, and in the post-Cold War period, to finally try to project some ideas in the case we have a major political change in the country this year. So for the first moment, 1919, and isolationism. During the post-World War I peace negotiations, with the Eastern South Atlantic still dominated by colonialism, the Brazilian delegation showed indifference to the transformations to be promoted by the League of Nations and remained mainly concerned with economic issues. The evaluation of Brazilian performance in Versailles and at the League of Nations is one of frustration. When looking at Brazil in the multilateral system, an interesting discussion that could allow us to understand the embarrassing departure of the League in 1926 is the lack of parliamentary-type articulation in the new multilateral diplomacy. The Brazilian delegation only articulated occasionally with representatives of the so-called small powers. Concerned with raising Brazil's prestige in an individualist and nationalist calculation, Brazilians refused to use a parliamentary strategy of forming blocs of nations to act in the new diplomatic assembly. The analysis of historian Olivier Compagnon goes even further, pointing out a certain farce and disloyalty in the actions of the Brazilian delegation. For Compagnon, in order to obtain and conserve a seat on the Council of the League, Brazilians put, I quote, in mute their initial demands for equivalent treatment among all independent states, end of quote. A purely oligarchic view of the system prevailed. Regarding the fiasco in articulating a multilateral policy and the melancholy departure of Brazil from the League in 1926, historian Luiz Villafañe understands as hollow the Brazilian moves in the task of serving as a liaison and representing Latin America before the international community. The post-1945 re-inauguration of multilateralism would see the first great and supposedly cohesive articulation of Brazil to act in the Parliament of Humanity. Second moment, 1945, and the failed Third War. Even if offering again only a very modest contribution to the war effort, for the second time, the country was the only representative of Latin America to have a seat during the peace conferences. If Brazilians engaged one more time in the talks with with the hope to be heard as a sovereign and important nation, multilateral diplomacy and the logics of parliamentary politics were finally recognized as paving a viable way so small and medium powers could once and for all rise in importance in international politics. Having this horizon in mind, after several days fighting obstacles to voice their opinions during peace negotiations, Brazilians finally promoted a strategy of association with other delegations as the only viable way to create an alternative bloc, a non-aligned bloc. The only piece lacking was the consistency and the solidity of this imagined bloc. How then create a solid group of nations to check not just the Soviet, but also the American bloc, the East and the West? Once again, the mobilization of the South Atlantic would not be the answer. Influenced by a classic Western Greek-Roman cultural background, but also by an anti-communist sentiment, by a strong idea of Christianity, and by conservatism, Brazilian delegation foresaw only one possibility: to create a Latin union of nations across the Atlantic. For Brazilian politicians and diplomats, by promoting such formula, the country could aspire to lead not just Latin Americans, 21 out of 51 members of the UN organization, but also France and Belgium, what could give also 3 out of 9 Security Council seats, including a veto power. Despite an initial enthusiasm with the idea and the creation of the Latin Union in 1948, the organization ended up disappearing after its second summit in 1954 in Madrid, considered a fiasco due to the internal disputes. Actually, beyond being affected by the most immediate effects of the Cold War, Latinity itself was absolutely not recognized as an identity to give strength to a political bloc in the multilateral system. While many officials at Rio seemed not to realize yet or resisted to accept that there was a post-colonial and interracial world emerging, a third force in international relations eventually emerged a few years later in Bandung to overcome imperialism and avoid alignment with Washington or Moscow. Conservatism, disconnection with civil society, denying of its own history, anachronistic vision of colonialism, and the beginning of the Cold War, all these factors combined took away the possibility of any protagonism for Rio in multilateral diplomacy, while creating a disastrous Atlantic policy that actually troubled the dialogue with the non-aligned movement in the following decades. Third moment, post-Cold War strategies. The following equally promising opportunity to Brazil to project itself into the political multilateral system and develop an alternative Atlantic policy would come only with the end of the bipolar conflict, while the multilateral system was unfreezing. At that moment, historical dependence with the US still marked the spirits at Brasilia. However, despite the apparent triumph of the Western Bloc, Brazilians did not take American unipolarity as the certain future scenario, especially when considered the long run. The views from 2 ministers symbolize the debate of ideas on the future multilateral order inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the 1990s and the early 21st century, or as I say, the tale of 2 Celsos. Celso Laffer, minister in 1992 and then in 2001 and 2002, and Celso Amorim, minister from 93 to 95, and later from 2003 until 2011. According to the first, economics seemed to be dictating Brazilian foreign policy. For Celso Laffer, after the dynamics of the Cold War have created opportunities to place economic development as a priority in the international agenda, the new international order appeared not yet suitable to accept profound changes conducted or demanded by the Third War, with multipolarity very limited and unfriendly to Brazil. Yet Celso Amorim, believing a multilateral system operative, as during the successful UN intervention in the Iraq-Kuwait crisis, imagined the 1990s as a time of changing not capable of being opposed by the United States. For Amorim, Neither Washington nor the American way of life could offer answers to all the interrogations a multilateral and diverse world was just about to ask. American unipolarity then would not be able to counter a new and reforming multilateral order. Even if not yet very clear concerning its final format, this order seemed at least offer a place where emerging powers could project a different existence. Both images of future multilateral order would dialogue during the 1990s while the country stabilized its economy and consolidated democracy. Then, in 2003, when for the second time he replaced Lafayette as foreign minister, Amorim finally could frame a strategy to fit Brazil in the multilateral order. In that sense, neither resignation, alignment, or independent action would distinguish Brazilian's position, but mostly the building of developing countries' coalitions as the G20s and the BRICS. But for our exercise here today, the strong and clear African strategy, a South Atlantic policy based on idea of common roots and identity to promote normative influence, economic influence, and cooperation in development. This moment, however, also lasted a few years. Perhaps not by chance the years of the commodity boom, but even so, building unprecedented cooperation with Africa, with links that could be easily resumed. Indeed, from 1995 to 2010, Brazil signed 274 technical cooperation agreements with African countries. To mention a few ones, 59 agreements in the area of the education, 48 in health cooperation, 31 in agriculture, 17 in public policies, and 12 with an environmental agenda. Aggravating the freeze or the rupture, the political crisis of 2016, with the removal of the president from power, still lingers and prevents us from realizing any new and clear proposal for the short time. Fourth moment, and my conclusion, the future as the moment for the South Atlantic, ? We are in a moment of absolute uncertainty, but a fourth phase may start on January 1st if a new government takes over, which would be driven by the cooperation structures established between the Cardoso and Lula governments and were created and supported by a new national identity and deep review in Brazil, in a very stressful and conflictive process, a South Atlantic identity, in a population that in 2010, for the first time in a national census since its independence, recognized itself as being a majority of Afro-descendants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alexandre. Very food for thought we have here now, and especially these few weeks that are coming over on the future of Brazil. So with no further ado again, I will introduce Patrícia Daehnhardt. Thank you so much for being here. Patrícia is an integrated researcher at the Portuguese Institute for International Affairs at Nova University, Lisbon, and also an advisor to the National Defense Institute in Lisbon as well. She will be talking to us today on the EU and transatlantic challenges, the case of Germany's Zeitenwende in the context of the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much, Patrícia. 15 minutes as well.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone here in the room and everyone who's accompanying us online. I would like to extend my gratitude and my thanks to the LPAZ Association and also to the organizing committee, in particular to Mónica and to Antonio for having invited me. And I come here to talk to you in terms of an Atlantic perspective from the European Union perspective and the transatlantic challenge that the war in Ukraine has set upon us, has set upon Europe, has set upon Portugal, and has set upon the transatlantic relations. So I'll be focusing mainly on the last 6 months and looking in particular at the case study, what I see as a case study of Germany and its recent changes in its foreign security and defense policy. So to do so, I would like to start with 3 initially three initial brief points to set the stage for the analysis of present transatlantic relations in the Euro-Atlantic area. So my first point would be inevitably the starting point that the Russian military invasion of Ukraine in February of this year means basically that the European security order, which was created mostly after 1991, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the implosion of the Soviet Union, that this European security order, which had already been fairly fragile since the annexation of Crimea and the changes of relations between Europe, the US on the one side, and Russia on the other side, basically that this European security order collapsed the latest on the 24th of February. And that as a consequence, we are now living, like Alexandre just said, uncertain times, not only for Brazil domestically, but certainly uncertain times for us all, because we have entered what I see as a confrontational international disorder. So there's been this change, very abrupt change, caused by the return of a hot war, a military conflict in Europe. And basically this means that the rules and values-based global or liberal or Western order, that basically this is very much crumbling. We knew this for some time, but this war in Ukraine has really shown us that we have to rethink our premises, and some states really have to rethink also the fundaments of their foreign and security policy, and Germany is certainly an interesting case in that sense. Secondly, in this new confrontational order, it seems clear from a European perspective, also from a transatlantic perspective in general, it seems clear that NATO and the transatlantic alliance's revitalization, which had been set in motion with President Biden last year, that this needs to endure. It seems fairly clear that this is one certainty where more or less there seems to be a consensus among NATO allies, but also among the EU as such, that this unity that Russia's aggression caused, that this was very important, but that this needs to endure. So there was unity in response. There has been unity in response, not from NATO, but from NATO allies individually. There has been a unified response from the European Union, which has defined and decided upon 6 packages of sanctions. Finland and Sweden, traditionally neutral countries, have asked for NATO membership, plus the EU/NATO members have pledged to finally reach the 2% target of defense spending of their GDP, something which was agreed upon at the NATO Wales summit in 2014. And then finally, I'm not going to go into it because Michele, of course, is going to talk about NATO's new strategic concept, but it's a concept which very clearly defines the transatlantic position, the allies' position vis-a-vis Russia, which for the first time identifies Russia clearly as a direct threat to the security of the alliance as a whole. So there is this idea on the one hand that the transatlantic alliance, which for the 4 years with the previous American governments had been in dire straits, as we all remember for different reasons, that this that this revitalization this momentum needs to be kept, not only because of the war, but certainly because European countries see the need to uphold this transatlantic alliance. And this takes me to the third point, which is that the Europeans will have to finally get serious. If Europeans will not now get serious about their own security and defense, then when will they do so? They have a common security and defense policy, which was adopted by the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. Developments have gone in that sense, but if we look at the defense spending of, in this case, the NATO countries, and looking at the chart from 2022 published by NATO, indeed the United States spends 3.47% of its GDP on defense, whereas countries such as Germany only spend 1.44%. And that makes a huge difference, of course, to the so-called European capability or the strength of the European countries put together when compared to the United States, which spends slightly less than 750 billion dollars on defense, whereas Germany spends roughly around 45 billion euros. There's a change. 45 billion euros. 1.44% of its GDP. So if these are the three starting points to how I look at Germany, the question is, what is Germany's role here? And Germany's role here traditionally has been one of pursuing a foreign policy continuity, basically not really changing the premises of its security and defense foreign policy, very much based on ideas. I wouldn't call it pacifism. Germany was not a pacifist country, but a civilian country. So as to say, it had military capabilities, it had military, it invested in the military, but it was first and foremost an economic power, a civilian power, very much resorting to international institutions and looking at military power or the use of military force only as a last resource. Combined with this element of its civilian power identity, Germany was probably the country which had benefited most from the end of the Cold War. Which basically was the extension, the enlargement of NATO on the one hand, the enlargement of the European Union on the one hand, the center of gravity from Western Europe focused or changed towards Eastern European countries when they were integrated in these two institutions. So for Germany, everything was fine. Why should it change a foreign and security policy which worked well, where Germany could become one of the world's masters in terms of exports or champions in exports, economically speaking. And so Germany became really a status quo power. It became a status quo power because the status quo as it existed in the post-Cold War was perfectly serving its interests as a civilian power and interests basically as an economic giant and a military dwarfed in comparison. And the third point regarding Germany is the question of its relationship with Russia, which I will go into more detail in a second, but which basically was one of a close bilateral relationship until now, very much focused on an economic relationship, but as we all know now, very much based also on a security, on an energy importing vector of that economic policy. And so we had a sui generis relationship between Germany and Russia during these last 3 decades. So when Chancellor Scholz announced the now famous, or immediately famous, one could say, Zeitenwende speech. He gave the speech at the Bundestag on a Sunday morning, 3 days after the beginning of the war in Ukraine. It was sort of a revolution. In fact, some analysts called it a revolution. It really dropped as a bomb because Germany had been the most reluctant country to really change something about the relationship vis-a-vis Russia. And this announcement was a big turning point. Zeitenwende means a turning point, translated from German. And he made big announcement. He made big announcement basically in suggesting 3 changes / potential changes, because of course the jury is still out on whether Germany will be able to really implement what Scholz announced on that day. But he announced the creation of 100 billion special fund to modernize Germany's Germany's Bundeswehr. He announced that Germany would finally apply the 2% or over 2%, he said, of its GDP in defense expenditures, which would mean that from the 45 billion euros. Germany would now invest 75 billion euros, which of course would make it the biggest military power in Europe. And that is a huge change for all of Europe, but also within the transatlantic alliance. Then the Chancellor announced the procurement of US F-35 fighter jets, replacing outdated Tornadoes. He announced the acquisition of armed drones, something which was very controversial, particularly within his own Social Democratic Party, the SPD. And on the other hand, 2 days before the war began, actually, the German government announced that it would stop its restrictive policy of not sending weapons, to regions in conflict, thereby breaking already a taboo in German security and defense policy. So in terms of this announcement, all these measures in itself suggested that Germany would set aside its traditional culture of reluctance, or Kultur der Zurückhaltung, and sort of it suggested that it would change its defense policy. Secondly, this speech was important because it did announce this, or it suggested that Germany would now stop certain aspects of the bilateral relationship with Russia. So to say, this so-called Wandel durch Handel, the change through commerce, this idea that if we have economic, commercial trades with a country, this will lead this country to become more attuned to our own values and set of rules. This idea, which for a very long time guided the German foreign and economic policy, this sort of collapsed on that day, and ever since. The German Ostpolitik also they had to realize this was no longer really an option. And thirdly, Germany would stop being an interlocutor between the West and Russia in terms of trying to find a cooperative security order with Russia. And so thirdly, in terms of its consequences for Europe and transatlantic relations, and I really have to speed up a little bit, what are the implications of this? I think whereas on the one hand, Germany's neighbors immediately welcomed this change, saying, finally, you're coming out of this comfortable niche position where you've cocooned yourself into for so many decades, letting the Americans and the other ones doing the investment in hard security, that this now needed to come to an end. But whereas the immediate reaction was one of a positive acceptance that Germany would step up its role in security and defense policy, of course, we will now see, I'm sure, the emergence of countries who are doubtful of Germany's role, of course, for historical memories reasons, but also, for example, in relationship to different approaches, say, to the degree to which the European Union as an institution should be strategically autonomous from the US, from NATO. There's a difference in perspective between France, which has been continuously arguing in that sense, and President Macron has been very, very vocal about this, whereas Germany in the last 2 years, still with the previous government, the Merkel government, was certainly arguing in terms of strengthening NATO's European pillar. And so as to say, Europe should develop its capabilities more within NATO efforts and to strengthen a European pillar within NATO, which would mean then that the European Defense Cooperation would sort of, as a consequence, suffer from, or potentially have less incentives to promote certain projects solely within EU member countries as such. As I have to finish, I think I'll finish with a speech that Chancellor Scholz gave at the end of last month at the Charles University in Prague, and where he argued that Germany would support EU enlargement to the Western Balkans, and suggested that for that to happen, the European Union would need to undergo specific elements of reforming the institution as such, enlarging situations where the majority voting is the rule in terms of decisions taken within the EU. And of course, when we look and compare these two speeches, one suggested a Zeitenwende for Germany. This speech at Charles University, just recently done, suggested that Europe as a whole, that Germany's position is now that Europe as a whole needs to undergo a Zeitenwende. And what does this mean for transatlantic relations? What does this mean for the relationship between Europe and the US? Of course, we know that the US has been looking and has been pivoting to the Indo-Pacific for at least a decade, 2012, when Hillary Clinton announced that new strategy, which had already been in the making from Washington's side. So to conclude very briefly, and I can develop some ideas more in the Q&A session, to conclude, I think, and from a perspective from Portugal, I think what we will see in the coming years is that Germany's role is changing for several reasons. It had to change. It has now accepted that it's no longer the status quo, which does no longer exist, is no longer favorable to its own position. So it's now, I believe, changing. Change might be slow, might be happening more in one area than another, but this will have implications for transatlantic security, certainly. And the relationship between Germany and the United States, which has often been termed as a partnership and leadership, but which has not really come to fruition, is one of those possibilities. And Germany should also look at the Atlantic and the Azores. And on the other hand, I also think the Azores and the Portuguese decision makers should look at Germany. It might be difficult. It's culturally different, but it's a country, I think, that bilaterally this relationship should be invested. I'm sorry if I spoke so hard.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Patrícia. First of all, I apologize for having to be so strict. But definitely, I couldn't agree more with your final remarks. And I think also that we definitely should explore more this perspective of focusing on European countries. And regarding Germany's change, it was about time, definitely. So now, very quickly, I will give the floor to Michele Testoni. He comes from the IE University in Madrid. Michele is an adjunct professor of international relations in Madrid, as I've said. His main areas of research are NATO and transatlantic security relations, and he also serves as a secretary to the Transatlantic Studies Association, so I thought I should highlight that as well. So, Michele, thank you so much for being here, and again, 15 minutes. I will warn you in the last 5.
So thank you. I cannot avoid, follow the tie, and thanks to the organizer for the invitation. Hoping it's the first of many others. It's my first time to the Azores island, which look beautiful. So even more incentive to come here again. My presentation, as Mónica just said, is about NATO. And therefore, it's kind of a follow-up of what Patrícia just said, and try to discuss with you what is the place of the Atlantic Ocean, the Azores, in this new document that NATO approved a few months ago. So as you know, this is the fourth strategic document that NATO approves in the post-Cold War era. The first was in Rome in 1991, the second in Washington, 1999, the third in Lisbon, 2010, and now Madrid, 2022. And by doing so, I would like to go back to what Hugo Cabral said this morning to a question of mine, which was actually triggered by you. What can you tell us about the war in Ukraine? And he said, if I'm not mistaken, the only thing we need to be expected is we need to be prepared for the unexpected. kind of. And he's partially right, I guess. We are in the world of social sciences and we have some models, we need to interpret reality given the tools, the instruments we have in order to look at the past, try to describe and understand the present, and hopefully, for the better and the worst, try to foresee the future. And we know, for instance, by looking at the previous three strategic documents by NATO, that they devised a given environment that all of a sudden, all of them changed unexpectedly. So the strategic document of 1991 was essentially devised to cope with the end of the Cold War. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. It divides some form of cooperation with the almost former enemy, but then was unable to foresee the 1991 strategic document, the collapse of Yugoslavia, the revival of ethnic conflicts, whose long tail has arrived to the very far east of Europe, to Donbass, and the war we are actually seeing it. So there's a hidden, more or less, fil rouge that goes from Sarajevo to Kiev or to Donetsk, which is a thorny one. The second strategic document, 1999, the peak of globalization, the peak of humanitarian interventions, which turn into the responsibility to protect out-of-area operation, triggered by Bosnia, triggered by Kosovo. But then this did not foresee the hidden, unexpected consequences of the invasion of Iraq. So in April 1999, we have the issuing of this document. In the summer of 1999, we have already, we're in August 1998, the two bombings of the US Embassy in Kenya and Tanzania. We have some sites of Islamic-based terrorism which explode. As we know, the outburst in 9/11/2001. Then we go to Lisbon, 2010. In a moment of financial crisis, of imperial overextension of the United States. What do we do in Afghanistan? Of the beginning of, not yet, but was looming the Eurozone debt crisis, and the alliance came about with the three core tasks that somehow are still with us: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. This document basically was born quite old, because almost immediately in December 2010, we have in Tunisia the beginning of the Arab uprisings. And the BRICS, the rise of China. So the document, like the Byzantine Empire, was built old already, old-fashioned. So what can we expect by this document? These documents are, like our frameworks. We have a frame, and we miss the painting. We need to paint what is inside the framework. And what we have been so I had the privilege to stay at the Madrid NATO summit, so to talk with fellow colleagues, interact with some of the delegations. And it seems basically to oversimplify that we have three main goals that attain to NATO in the foreseeable future at the net of the of things that we cannot foresee, right? And these three pillars have been very good summarized by Sean Monaghan this a few weeks ago in the War on the Rocks. The three basic pillars: so to sharpen the sword, strengthen the shield, and bring back to the hedgehog. So sharpen the sword. So NATO apparently need to modernize, refurbish, eventually to increase nuclear deterrence, which is at odds to some of our principle of open society, of collaboration. Is it a time for a new 21st century Harmel report of a dual-track doctrine? As we know, there's a harsh change, it's Zeitenwende between the last two documents, In Lisbon 2010, Russia was mentioned as a partner, something we need to deal with. Now it's the most significant and direct threats to allies. So one thing is the sword is, which means what kind of doctrine, we are playing with fire. No, nuclear weapons are something very peculiar. Second, the shield, which is conventional forces. We have already 40,000 NATO troops in Eastern Europe, 5 battle groups in the eastern flank. There are 100,000 US troops, and there are discussion within the United States, no matter if the Democrats or Republicans, shall we increase it to 150,000 or 200,000? And European replies, it seems that this is your war, instead is ours. So there's this transatlantic misconceptions are all apparent misconceptions that are always there with us. And this gives to the traditional question, how much is enough, right? To defend, to fight, to signal Russia that you have to stop, etc. Which goes to what Patrícia just said, that the whole of us was, when the war started, what the hell? But then Taiwan. Now, is China reaping the benefit, or do you seize the opportunity to attack Taiwan? And we see what happened a few weeks ago with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. If 1 + 1 makes 2, it actually means that since the Obama administration, so Obama, Trump, Biden, the main strategic focus of the United States is Asia, is the pivot to Asia. It's Taiwan. Taiwan cannot be another Ukraine. So which entails a great step for Europeans, a window of opportunity or a poison gift, the European strategic compass. Where should we duplicate, or should we stay within NATO? What is autonomy? Because what does it mean? Troops, capabilities that touched from, we have to deal with Brexit. Now France is the only nuclear power within the EU, with Britain playing a sort of maverick. Is the other, let's call third, US, France, and then Britain, nuclear power within NATO, in the United Nations Security Council, but no longer in the European Union, right? Which brings me in this case to this strengthening the shield objective to air and maritime instruments. And it goes to the Azores, to Portugal, so to this area of relative peace and stability, which is the North Atlantic, the Azores, Greenland, Britain, Canada, and the United States. Fine. But if we look in perspective, the Atlantic Ocean is connected to the Mediterranean, therefore the Black Sea, the Baltic, right? So oceans, seas, you teach me, are connected, are interconnected. What happens in one sea arrives to the other sea sooner or later, right? And I get back to this in a while. 5 minutes yet. The hedgehog, so the third pillar. So nuclear deterrence, the shield, conventional forces to repeal Russia, to deal with Russia. The hedgehog, resilience. Economically speaking, the plans to get out of the pandemic, to sustain the energy crisis, the health crisis. These are here, my generation in particular, or even the younger generation, our students. In the last decade, they have lived through an endless series of crises that has significantly hit the social fabric of our societies. Debt crisis, immigration, delocalization, pandemic, war. Enough is enough. Now they're telling my country is going to elections in 2 weeks, problematic elections. So the third point, the hedgehog, is how to revitalize, how to rejuvenate a transatlantic bond. Shall we create a new transatlantic contract? What does it mean? EU, US, UK, then there's Turkey. It means dealing with hybrid threats. It means dealing with, and this comes in the new strategic concept, China. China is the greatest global challenge that we need to address. In a confrontational, in a cooperative way, what? And if we look, for instance, the whole of Latin America, Africa, several European countries, China now is our main trading partners. What does this mean? Hybrid threats means EDTs, emerging and disrupting technologies. It means artificial intelligence. It means autonomous systems. It means what are we apparently seeing in the war in Ukraine, how apparently technology is forbidding, is preventing a military escalation of the conflict. It means quantum technologies, it means biotechnologies. So how, given the process of technological acceleration that our generation has been living through, and we will keep living through, how this affects our own global, broader notion of security and safety and defense. We are walking through an uncharted territory. Last, indeed, and I think I can stop here, is how we cooperate in times of business and budget constraints. How do we cooperate with allies? Again, back to the Azores, to Portugal, to sea and maritime power. We always know that historically, when great power politics enters the stage, sea power seems to become even more important, tamed perhaps by air power. But what we see that China does, if we can basically deal with the untransparent data we have from China, that Chinese naval forces are those that are funded the most by China. Because China legitimately, correctly, needs to defend and protect its commercial routes from Shanghai till Africa, till Europe, right? We have already in Athens, in Valencia, Chinese, let's call Trojan horses. It will arrive to the Atlantic. So what do we do? In this case, I believe that we are in a partially positive path because the way in which we are dealing with emerging and disrupting technologies, the control of the sea routes, hybrid threats, migration, climate change, terrorism, we all know, are a good point, are a good stepping stone for promoting a cooperation between allies or among allies who tend to have different interests. As far as Portugal is concerned, in the strategic concept is mentioned Diana, the defense, information, investment, innovation, the defense innovation accelerator of the North Atlantic, with two agencies, two centers, one in Almada and the Iron Troia, Lisbon area, which already has two centers in Oeiras, another one in Lisbon, which depend to the ACT, the Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, not Mons. Which means, and I eventually try to respond to question and elaborate even more on this, that the role of these islands of Portugal, of let's call the Western flank, is to be a promoter of technological innovation, to try to see how to cope the different threats that are not related to traditional security, smuggling from our triangle, North Africa, Africa, North Latin America, Europe. So to provide a more comprehensive sense of our Western security that will naturally have in this, for the time being, peaceful area of the world, the North Atlantic, a center of a hub, a window of opportunity. So I think that, to conclude, that despite the fact that we are unable to foresee the future, despite the fact that strategic concepts cyclically ran out of track, there's still an opportunity to create, to enjoy the fact that the location of the Azores, of Portugal, the southern flank, Italy, Spain, Portugal, that we need to cope with all things that the strategic concept doesn't say. Hybrid threat is the emerging and disrupting technology. It's not just Russia. It's not just war. Legitimately, it's now that's the priority in the short term. But in the medium and long term, priorities will be others. And I will eventually reply later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michele. I don't mean to take people away from the coffee, which will be already short coffee, but I will give 10 minutes maximum to Q&A. I think our 3 papers were so full of ideas and challenging to our minds that we should use it. So please do say if you want to talk so that we can have the microphone. Because of the online transmission, we need to have the microphone. Questions, please? Yes, we have one here. One.
Good afternoon. The first question to Brazil. The new election will change the way you see the continue to be more African or be more European, the relationship between Brazil and Portugal. The second question is for German. These immigrants out of Ukraine are an effort for all the countries in Europe. The inflation is about more than 10% in a lot of countries. So we're going to be able to get money to invest in the war. And the third one, probably we will not have an nuclear war, but if the countries, if Russia invades one of the European countries, not only Ukrainian, what NATO will gonna do? If they, what NATO, if Russia invades or some other country in Europe that belongs to NATO, what NATO will do?
Thank you so much. 3 wonderful questions. I would follow the order of the speakers, if you don't mind, and ask you to be as brief as possible. Thank you.
So thank you for your question. I'll try to be brief and imagine scenarios. If we have the current government winning the elections, I think we're going to see the continuation of the retreat from Africa, unless maybe in the area of security where the military are still promoting cooperation with countries like Tanzania, but a continuing retreat from Africa. In the case we have a change, we're gonna have a new African policy. In the case of transatlantic relations with Portugal, maybe using Lusophony as a mean to reach the African population and cooperating with Portugal, but I don't believe it. Brazil build bridges directly with the Africans. Brazil is not using Portugal for that, but maybe with the ratification of the agreement between Mercosur and Europe and with the Ukrainian scenario, there we're going to have a new relationship with Europe, a very important one that we haven't seen in decades, and there Portugal can be a very important partner.
Thank you so much, Patrícia.
Thank you very much for the question. It's an important question because many European countries have to deal with the high number of refugees. But in concrete, your question about Germany's investment in defense, these 100 billion euros, they're meant to be invested in the modernization of the Bundeswehr, which has been really in a very bad condition in terms of spare parts, in terms of the proper troop equipment, etc. So I think those are 2 different things. regarding the high number of refugees, I think it's more a question of how society will respond to that change within the situation. I mean, it's not comparable. In 2015, in fact, Germany managed to accept over 1 million refugees. It sort of went okay. I'm not going to say it went perfectly well, but they did manage to integrate. I mean, it did actually work. Despite the skepticism of a lot. But I think there's another point to what you raised and the idea of the financial implications of the war is the question of the high electricity prices. Germany, for instance, there's already been allocated a package of 65 billion euros to provide with the assistance of families having to cope with the enormous increase of the energy prices. And I think this will have to be dealt with at a European level as well. So as to say, the fiscal rules, and Southern European countries are arguing that they should still stay flexible, whereas Germany, the finance minister, had just yesterday, a few days ago, said, he wants to go back to fiscal discipline. So we'll already see there are some implications of what you just suggested. So thank you.
If Russia invades a NATO country, NATO needs to reply, needs to defend. I doubt, although I cannot guarantee this will happen. We should talk more out of the psychological emotion. What is the place of Ukraine and Georgia within the EU and NATO? Ukraine is a candidate now of the EU, but hardly will happen. We know for the reasons why. But I would like to stress another point, that Russia is not only Russia. We are since technological innovation runs so fast, we are in a global state of undeclared wars through cyber threats. Russia is, and this is not espionage, is disruption. Scientific, civilian, military sites, information, hackers. Is this an act of war? Our legal codes are important. It's a legacy. It's a kind of heritage we have, and we need to cherish. But these are acts of they're threats. So this is a violation of sovereignty, not just to spy, to cheat, but it's to take and ask money. Right? It's a blackmail. So, and this keeps happening. So we are already in a state of undeclared, in a gray zone. So it's more complicated, unfortunately, than what it looks like.
Okay, thank you so much to all the three speakers. Unfortunately, we don't really have time to another round of questions, but I would invite you to do so to our speakers during the very small coffee break that we are going to have. So I would say 10 minutes maximum, 5 minutes. Oh, 15. Oh, God. Okay. I wasn't ready for this. Okay, so 5 minutes to make 10 to make 15. So thank you so much. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking again to our wonderful speakers.